The tunnel stretched endlessly into darkness, its walls embedded with veins of gold that caught the flickering light of industrial lamps. Each glimmer told a story of wealth extracted, lives lost, and promises broken. This was no ordinary mine shaft. It was the beating heart of a decades-long betrayal, carved deep beneath the red earth of Burkina Faso's Sahel region. In the suffocating heat of the underground chamber, American mining executives in their $1,000 suits now knelt in the dust, their hands bound with military-grade zip ties. Their faces, once confident in boardrooms from New York to Zurich, were now etched with fear and disbelief. The golden walls that had made them millionaires now served as witnesses to their downfall. Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked past them with measured steps, his military boots echoing against the polished stone floor. Each footfall was deliberate, each pause calculated, to let the weight of the moment settle into the bones of every person present. His elite guards flanked him, men and women who had grown up in villages where children drank poisoned water while foreigners grew rich from the land beneath their feet. The air crackled with an electricity that had nothing to do with the harsh floodlights illuminating the scene. Camera flashes erupted like lightning, capturing every angle of this unprecedented moment. International news crews jostled for position, their lenses focused on what would become the defining image of African resource sovereignty in the 21st century. "This gold is ours," Traoré's voice cut through the silence like a blade forged in righteous fire. His words carried the weight of generations who had watched their wealth disappear into foreign vaults while their children went hungry. "Every ounce you stole, every life you cost, ends today." The executives avoided his gaze, their once proud postures broken under the collective weight of a nation's eyes. Outside the tunnel, thousands had gathered, their chants rumbling through the earth like distant thunder. The sound pressed against the walls, a living force that seemed to make the very gold in the stone pulse with anger. What the world was witnessing was more than spectacle. It was history unfolding in real time. The gold tunnel, carved from ancestral earth and polished by decades of greed, had become a stage for truth. Every step Traoré took echoed not just off the walls, but through the consciousness of a continent that had remained silent too long. The desert breathed differently at night. Under the vast canopy of stars that had watched over the Sahel for millennia, the mining compound sat like a fortress of greed, its high walls topped with razor wire that gleamed silver in the moonlight. Towers punctuated the perimeter at precise intervals, their floodlights sweeping across the yard in methodical 30-second cycles that had become as routine as breathing to the guards within. Inside, air-conditioned luxury quarters that stood in stark contrast to the mud-brick homes of nearby villages. American mining executives slept soundly on Egyptian cotton sheets, unaware that their empire of exploitation was about to crumble. Their dreams were filled with profit margins and stock options, while outside their windows, the very earth they had pillaged was preparing its revenge. Captain Ibrahim Traoré crouched low in the sand dunes with his elite intelligence unit, men and women who had trained in the harshest conditions the Sahel could offer. They had been tracking this operation for months, piecing together a puzzle of corruption that stretched from the remote mining sites to the gleaming towers of international finance. Tonight, all the careful planning, all the patient surveillance, all the accumulated evidence would finally come together in decisive action. The investigation was meticulous. Satellite images revealed the true scope of the illegal tunnels, a vast network stretching for miles beneath the desert, connecting hidden extraction points to secret storage facilities. Whistleblowers, their faces covered and voices disguised, had provided crucial intelligence about shipping schedules and security rotations. Financial forensics experts had traced the money through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts, following the trail of Burkina Faso's stolen wealth as it disappeared into the global banking system. "Move." Traoré's command was barely above a whisper, but it set in motion a perfectly choreographed assault that had been rehearsed dozens of times. Like a tide breaking against stone, his unit advanced through the darkness, their movements ghostly and precise. Each soldier knew their role, each team had their target, each objective had been planned down to the second. The first team scaled the western wall with the fluid grace of desert cats, their equipment muffled and their breathing controlled. Within seconds, they had cut the power to the outer security grid. The compound's lights flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the area into shadows broken only by the pale glow of a crescent moon hanging like a scimitar in the star-drunk sky. At the southern entrance, another team disabled the security cameras with precision shots from silenced weapons. Each lens cracked with a sound no louder than a whisper, but the effect was devastating to the compound's electronic defenses. In the central control room, monitors went dark one by one, leaving confused guards staring at blank screens and wondering if they were experiencing a system malfunction. Inside the compound, the first pair of guards to notice something was wrong rounded a corner with flashlights cutting through the darkness. They were veterans of private security, men who had worked dangerous contracts from Iraq to Afghanistan, but nothing had prepared them for the efficiency of Traoré's forces. Two shadows dropped from above with weapons trained, forcing them to the ground without a shot fired or an alarm raised. The guards found themselves zip-tied and gagged before they fully understood what was happening. Traoré moved through the compound as if he had walked its pathways 100 times before. His memory of the satellite imagery was flawless, every building mapped, every blind spot identified. He led his team toward the administrative block, the nerve center of the operation, where the most damning evidence would be stored. The heavy wooden door of the main office splintered under a single strike from a breaching tool, the sound muffled by the thick walls and desert air. Inside, the room smelled of stale coffee, expensive cologne, and the particular mustiness that comes from papers handling vast sums of money. Filing cabinets lined the walls like silent sentries guarding secrets, but it was the steel safe in the corner that drew Traoré's immediate attention. The safe stood open, not because someone had been careless, but because the Americans had grown so arrogant, so secure in their perceived invincibility, that they no longer bothered with basic precautions. Inside, manila folders bulged with printed documents that would have taken months to accumulate through traditional intelligence gathering. Wire transfers documenting billions in stolen revenue, export licenses bearing forged signatures, and photographs of gold shipments hidden beneath crates of supposed agricultural goods. But the most damning evidence was a series of detailed maps showing the underground tunnel network. Each tunnel was marked with dates, shipment weights, and routing information. The maps revealed not just the scope of the theft, but its sophistication, an operation that had been running for over a decade, stealing an estimated $4 billion worth of gold from the people of Burkina Faso. "This is it," Traoré said quietly, his voice carrying a mix of vindication and sorrow. Behind him, investigative journalist Awa Diarra worked quickly with her camera, capturing every page, every damning detail. She wasn't supposed to be there. Journalists were rarely allowed in military operations, but Traoré had insisted on her presence. The people must see what was hidden from them, he had told her. They must know the full scope of what was stolen. As they delved deeper into the files, the evidence became even more overwhelming. Laptops still logged into encrypted accounts showed real-time financial transfers. Invoices from European refineries documented where the stolen gold was being processed. Email chains revealed a casual arrogance that was breathtaking in its audacity. "No African authority would dare touch us," read one message. "We own half their government and rent the other half." Each discovery was another nail in the coffin of the empire these men had built on lies and stolen earth. But the operation wasn't proceeding without tension. As Traoré's team secured the records, a gunshot cracked through the night from the far side of the compound, shattering the careful quiet like breaking glass. His radio crackled to life. "Contact at the north gate!" The word sent adrenaline coursing through every soldier in the compound. In an instant, the methodical evidence gathering became a race against time. Traoré sprinted toward the sound, his team close behind, their boots pounding against the packed earth. At the north gate, a handful of American-hired security contractors had formed a desperate defensive line, their rifles raised and their faces grim. These weren't the regular guards. These were professionals, mercenaries who had been brought in specifically to handle situations like this. One of them barked into a radio in English, thick with panic. "Get them out now! The whole operation is blown!" A black SUV roared to life nearby, its headlights slicing through the darkness like searching eyes. The vehicle's tires spun in the sand as the driver desperately tried to escape, but the route had already been blocked by Traoré's advance teams. The sound of the spinning wheels was joined by the harsh bark of military commands and the metallic click of weapons being readied. "Drop your weapons!" Traoré's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of a man who had never doubted he would reach this moment. The contractors hesitated, their training warring with their survival instincts. In that moment of uncertainty, a flashbang grenade detonated near the SUV, the burst of light and sound forcing everyone to the ground. The vehicle's doors flew open like broken wings, and out stumbled two of the key executives, men whose names had appeared on every damning document in the safe. Their faces were pale in the artificial dawn of the flares, their expensive suits rumpled from sleep and terror. One tried to speak, to invoke diplomatic immunity or corporate protection, but Traoré soldiers closed in with quiet efficiency, binding their wrists with the same zip ties that held their subordinates. More executives were dragged from their quarters, some protesting their innocence, others trembling in silence. The air was thick with dust kicked up by vehicles and running feet, but thicker still than the unspoken knowledge that the power dynamic that had existed for decades had shifted forever in the span of a single night. Traoré stood before them as dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, his presence as steady and immovable as the ground beneath their knees. "You have stolen from my people," he said, his voice carrying over the sound of soldiers securing the area. One of the executives, a tall man with silver hair, who had once commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents, tried to step forward. His voice carried traces of the old arrogance. "You can't touch us. We have diplomatic protections, legal frameworks, international law." Traoré's eyes hardened like cooling metal. "Not here. Not anymore." Awa Diarra sat in the dim glow of her small apartment, surrounded by what could only be described as organized chaos. Papers covered every surface, her wooden table, the floor, even her bed, like fragments of a massive puzzle that, once assembled, would reveal the scope of the greatest theft in her nation's history. The city outside her window had settled into the quiet of deep night, broken only by the occasional hum of a passing motorcycle or the distant call of night birds. Her hands trembled slightly as she held each document, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of what she possessed. These weren't just papers, they were proof of betrayal on a scale so vast it was difficult to comprehend. Dozens of contracts, all bearing the signatures of American mining executives and high-ranking officials in Burkina Faso. Some were printed on official government letterhead, others bore corporate seals, but all shared one common trait: corruption woven into every clause like a cancer eating away at the nation's future. As she read each page, Awa felt her anger building like pressure in a sealed container. Every clause represented betrayal. Every signature meant suffering for her people. The money that had disappeared into private pockets while children died from drinking contaminated water, while schools crumbled for lack of resources, while entire villages were abandoned as the land became too poisoned to sustain life. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her mounting rage. It was a secure line, encrypted and regularly swept for surveillance. "Awa, it's Karim," the voice said. He was her editor at Radio Wa Libre, the last independent station in the country willing to air stories the government preferred to bury. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many journalists disappear for asking inconvenient questions. "Do you have enough?" he asked without preamble. Awa looked at the mountain of evidence spread before her, enough to destroy careers, topple governments, and potentially get her killed in the process. "Enough to bury them all," she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was contemplating. Karim's pause stretched long enough for her to hear her own heartbeat. "Then you know what comes next. Midnight broadcast. We'll patch you in live. But Awa," his voice took on the tone of a father speaking to a daughter about to walk into danger, "once you do this, there's no turning back. You understand that, right?" She closed her eyes, letting the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. She had been a journalist long enough to understand the mathematics of courage. The more important the truth, the more dangerous it became to tell it. Threats, blacklists, mysterious accidents, people who simply vanished. These were the occupational hazards of speaking truth to power in a country where power often responded with violence. But she also understood something else with crystalline clarity. Silence was a form of complicity, and she had sworn long ago never to be complicit in her people's suffering. "I'll be ready," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. By the time the clock struck midnight, the small radio studio felt charged with electricity. The walls seemed to pulse with the weight of what was about to happen. Karim sat behind the control board, his weathered face illuminated by the soft glow of equipment lights, his eyes fixed on Awa as she adjusted her microphone with hands that were steady now, focused by the certainty of purpose. The red on-air sign glowed like an ember in the darkness, and across Burkina Faso, radios crackled to life in homes, shops, and gathering places where people still believed in the power of truth to change the world. "Good evening, Burkina Faso," she began, her voice calm and measured, but carrying an undercurrent of fire that listeners could feel through their speakers. "Tonight, I will not tell you a story. I will show you the truth." She deliberately shuffled the papers near her microphone, ensuring the rustling sound was picked up clearly. It was important that listeners hear the physical evidence, understand that this wasn't speculation or rumor, but documented fact backed by official papers and signatures. For years, we have been told that foreign mining partnerships are our path to prosperity. We have been promised that the gold taken from our land would return to us in the form of schools, hospitals, roads, and opportunity. But these documents, she paused, letting the gravity of the moment settle on her listeners, tell a very different story. What followed was a methodical dismantling of decades of lies. She read excerpts that named names and cited specific amounts. A minister who had approved illegal mining permits in exchange for a mansion in the French Riviera. A corporate lawyer who had funneled millions through fake charities while villages went without clean water. an American executive who had written in an email with casual arrogance that was breathtaking. "No African court will ever touch us. We own the judges and rent the politicians." Each revelation landed on the airwaves like a bomb exploding in slow motion. Phone lines began lighting up within minutes, but not with the angry demands or death threats she had expected. Instead, the voices were different, quieter, more shaken, but somehow more determined. The first caller was a teacher from Bobo Dioulasso, who hadn't been paid in 6 months while officials built swimming pools with stolen gold revenue. Then came a farmer whose ancestral lands had been poisoned by runoff from illegal mining operations. A widow called to speak about her husband, who had died in a tunnel collapse that the company never officially acknowledged, leaving her with 3 children and no compensation. But it was the anger that built as the night wore on that truly revealed the scope of the betrayal. Callers began demanding not just resignations, but trials, restitution, justice. One man's voice cracked with emotion as he shouted over the airwaves, "We have bled so they could feast. No more." In living rooms across the country, families huddled around radios as if the very air had changed composition. Children who had been asleep were awakened by the sound of their parents' voices rising in anger and recognition. This was their story being told, their suffering being acknowledged, their stolen wealth being documented in ways that made denial impossible. Awa could feel the shift happening in real time, an awakening that was spreading through the collective consciousness of the nation like wildfire in dry grass. She read one final excerpt from a contract, her voice sharp with righteous indignation. "In the event of government inquiry, all disputes shall be settled privately." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like an indictment. "My fellow citizens, they believed they could keep their crimes private forever. But tonight, those crimes are public. Tonight, the gold they thought belonged to them is revealed as ours in truth, if not yet in law." As the clock ticked past 1 a.m., Karim signaled that it was time to wrap up, but Awa had one more message to deliver. She leaned close to the microphone for her closing words, speaking directly to every listener as if they were sitting across from her at a kitchen table. "Captain Ibrahim Traoré has captured the men who signed these deals. Soon they will stand before you, and you will have the chance to decide their fate. But know this: justice does not end with the guilty kneeling in shame. Justice begins when the people rise to claim what has always been theirs." The line went dead, and for a moment the studio was silent except for the electronic hum of equipment and the sound of 2 people trying to process what they had just unleashed into the world. Karim let out a long breath and shook his head slowly. "You just changed everything," he said quietly. Outside the station, the streets were still dark, but Awa could hear something new in the distance, faint at first, then growing stronger. Voices, chants, the sound of people moving through the night, carrying the echo of her broadcast like a torch passed from hand to hand. She stepped out into the cool pre-dawn air, clutching her bag of documents like a weapon forged from paper and ink. She knew the coming days would bring danger, that powerful people would try to discredit her, threaten her, or worse. But she also knew with absolute certainty that something fundamental had shifted in the consciousness of her nation. The people had heard the truth, and once truth takes root in the fertile soil of righteous anger, it spreads with the inevitability of sunrise. The convoy moved slowly along the dirt road, raising clouds of pale dust that hung in the air like grief made visible. Captain Traoré stood in the back of the lead vehicle, his eyes scanning a horizon that told a story of environmental devastation spanning decades. The landscape here was a monument to greed. Where once fertile fields had stretched to meet acacia trees, now only cracked earth remained, poisoned and barren. They were traveling through what had once been the breadbasket of this region, visiting villages that had paid the ultimate price for foreign wealth extraction. These weren't just statistics in a report or names on a map. These were real people who lived, loved, worked, and died, while corporate executives thousands of miles away calculated profit margins. The first village appeared on the horizon like a mirage of devastation. Where thriving homes should have stood, only the skeletal remains of mud brick structures remained, their walls cracked like broken teeth, their roofs long since collapsed under the weight of neglect and despair. The well in the center of the village square was sealed with rusted metal sheets, a silent testament to water that had been declared too dangerous to drink. A small group of survivors waited under the shade of a single tree that somehow still clung to life despite the poisoned soil. Among them stood Miriam, an elderly woman whose spine was bent with age, but whose eyes still burned with the fierce light of memory. She leaned heavily on a wooden staff carved with symbols that spoke of better times, when the earth still gave life instead of taking it. As the convoy came to a stop, she stepped forward without hesitation, her weathered face calm but determined. "You came," she said simply, as if she had been expecting this moment for years. Traoré removed his military beret and bowed his head slightly in a gesture of respect that spoke louder than any words. "I had to see this with my own eyes," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that leadership meant bearing witness to suffering, not hiding from it. She nodded once, then motioned for him to follow her through the ruins of what had once been her community. They walked past the remains of homes where families had gathered for evening meals, past fields where nothing had grown for years, past a small mosque whose minaret still stood, but whose interior was filled only with the echo of prayers no longer offered. "It started when they came with their machines," Miriam began, her voice steady despite the pain of memory. "They promised us jobs, roads, a medical clinic. They gave our young men helmets and told them to dig into the earth. We did not know they would take more than gold. They would take our future." She stopped near the sealed well, tapping its metal cover with her staff. The sound rang hollow, like a funeral drum. "One morning, the water smelled strange. We thought it was just the rains stirring up the earth. It had happened before during the wet season. But within weeks, our children began to fall sick in ways we had never seen." Her voice remained steady, but Traoré could see her knuckles whiten as she gripped her staff more tightly. Their skin broke out in sores that would not heal. Their bellies swelled with pain that medicine could not touch. We took them to the clinic the mining company had built, a small building with a nurse who had no training and no supplies. She could only tell us she could not help. The air around them seemed to grow heavier as she continued. "My grandson Musa was 8 years old, a strong boy who could run from here to those hills and back without stopping to catch his breath. He was going to be a teacher, he told me. He wanted to help other children learn to read." Her voice wavered for the first time. "One evening, he drank from this well. We had boiled the water as we always did, but it made no difference. That night, he could not stop coughing. Blood came with the cough. By morning, he was gone." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind across the barren landscape. Even the soldiers who had accompanied Traoré stood motionless, their usual alertness replaced with a respectful stillness that acknowledged they were standing on ground made sacred by suffering. Miriam continued walking, leading them to the edge of the village where a stream had once flowed. Now the waterway was thick with yellowish foam that collected along the banks like infected wounds. "This is what they left us," she said, pointing with her staff at the contaminated water. "We could no longer farm. The goats died first, their milk turned bitter, then they simply stopped breathing. Then people began to leave, seeking cleaner land, work that would not kill them." She turned to face Traoré fully, her gaze unwavering. "Captain, they didn't just steal our gold. They murdered our home. They killed our children. They poisoned the earth our ancestors had tended for generations. You must make them answer for every life, not just every ounce of metal." Traoré's jaw tightened with determination. "They will," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a sacred vow. "I promise you they will face justice for every child, every poisoned well, every family torn apart." He gestured to his soldiers, who immediately began documenting everything, photographing the sealed well, the contaminated stream, the abandoned homes. Soil samples were carefully collected in sealed containers for forensic analysis. Water from the poisoned stream was gathered for testing that would provide scientific evidence of the contamination. Awa Diarra moved through the scene with quiet reverence, her camera capturing not just the physical devastation, but the human cost. She recorded Mariam's testimony, knowing that this elderly woman's words would carry more power than any government report or corporate denial. The video footage would show the world what corporate greed looked like when it was stripped of euphemisms and legal protection. As they moved back towards the village center, Mariam stopped beside a row of small mounds marked with simple wooden crosses and crescent-shaped stones. "We could not afford proper headstones," she explained, her voice soft with sorrow. "So we planted flowers to mark where they rest, but even the flowers die here now. The earth itself has been murdered." She looked directly at Traoré, her weathered hands clasped around her staff. "When you take those men before the people's court, tell them about Musa. Tell them about all the children sleeping under this poisoned ground. Tell them their names deserve to be remembered." He placed his hand over his heart in a gesture of solemn promise. "Their names will not be forgotten. Every child, every mother, every father, their stories will be told, and justice will speak their names." Around them, more villagers began to emerge from the shadows. Survivors who had been too afraid or too broken to show themselves initially. Some carried faded photographs of lost loved ones, holding them up like evidence for an invisible jury. Others brought containers of discolored water, shaking them so the sediment swirled like accusations made liquid. The gathering grew into an impromptu memorial, with each person adding their voice to the growing chorus of testimony. An old man spoke of his son, who had worked in the mines and died of lung disease before his 30th birthday. A young mother told of her baby, born with deformities after she drank contaminated water during pregnancy. A former mine worker showed the chemical burns on his hands from handling equipment without proper protection. Traoré listened to every story, his presence serving as both witness and judge. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the village square with the authority of someone who had seen the full scope of the injustice and would not rest until it was addressed. "I came here to see the truth," he said, his words audible to everyone present. "Now I have seen it, and I swear to you by everything I hold sacred, those responsible will answer for every life lost, every drop of water poisoned, every home destroyed. They will kneel not only before the gold they stole, but before the people they wronged." A murmur ran through the crowd, building into a low chant that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Justice, justice. It wasn't shouted or screamed, it was spoken with the quiet determination of people who had endured too much to be satisfied with anything less than complete accountability. As the convoy prepared to leave, Mariam stepped close to Traoré one final time. "Captain," she said, softly, "when you stand before them in judgment, remember this place. Remember Musa, and remember that some wounds cannot be healed with money alone. They require truth, acknowledgement, and the kind of justice that changes hearts as well as laws. He met her gaze with the full weight of his commitment. I will remember every word, every face, every name. As they drove away, the village receded into the distance, becoming a ghost of what it had once been. But the image of Mariam, standing beside the sealed well, her staff planted firmly in the poisoned earth, remained vivid in everyone's mind. The fight was no longer just about stolen gold, it was about stolen lives, and that realization transformed the entire nature of the justice they were seeking. The gold tunnel felt different now. No longer a hidden chamber of secrets, but a cathedral of accountability. The air was cooler than expected, and every surface seemed to catch and amplify the harsh white light of portable flood lamps. The walls themselves appeared to pulse with significance, each vein of gold serving as both evidence and witness to the crimes that had been committed. Soldiers lined the entrance with rifles slung but ready, their presence serving not as intimidation but as a reminder that this justice belonged to the people, protected by those who served the nation rather than foreign interests. Beyond them, cameras from national and international television crews captured every moment, their lenses trained on what would become one of the most significant trials in African history. In the center of the tunnel, the American executives knelt on the polished stone floor, their expensive suits now rumpled and stained with the dust of their downfall. Their hands were bound with military restraints, but their real captivity was the weight of truth that surrounded them, making escape impossible, even if their bonds were cut. The tunnel began to fill as witnesses entered. Not lawyers in expensive suits or judges in formal robes, but the people whose lives had been destroyed by corporate greed. They came slowly, reverently, as if entering a sacred space. Villagers clutched photographs of lost children. Former miners carried broken tools and dented helmets that told stories of dangerous working conditions and workplace casualties. Mothers held jars of contaminated water, the murky liquid serving as liquid evidence of environmental crimes. Each person who entered added to the weight of testimony that would be delivered. This was not a courtroom in the traditional sense. There were no formal procedures, no legal technicalities, no opportunities for high-priced lawyers to obscure truth with procedural objections. This was the people's tribunal, and the people themselves would serve as both jury and judge. At the far end of the tunnel, Captain Traoré stood with his characteristic stillness. His military bearing served as an anchor point for the proceedings. He didn't need to speak yet. His mere presence commanded the space and reminded everyone present that this moment had been earned through courage, investigation, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The first witness to step forward was Mariam, her wooden staff tapping against the stone floor as she walked, without hesitation, towards the kneeling executives. She stopped only a few feet away from them, close enough that they could see the lines carved into her face by years of struggle and loss. When she spoke, her voice carried through the tunnel with the clarity of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. "You took my grandson's life," she said, her tone steady but heavy with accumulated grief. "You poisoned our water, destroyed our land, and left us to bury our children in the soil that will never grow again. You thought distance would protect you, that no one would come for you in your comfortable offices and gated compounds." She paused, letting her words settle into the silence before continuing. I am here to tell you that we came. We found you, and now you must face what you have done." The executives avoided her gaze, staring at the floor as if they could hide from the truth by refusing to acknowledge it. But Mariam's voice followed them into their attempted escape from reality. She looked directly at Traoré, her weathered hands clasped around her staff. "When you take those men before the people's court, tell them about Musa. Tell them about all the children sleeping under this poisoned ground. Tell them their names deserve to be remembered." He placed his hand over his heart in a gesture of solemn promise. "Their names will not be forgotten. Every child, every mother, every father, their stories will be told, and justice will speak their names." Around them, more villagers began to emerge from the shadows. Survivors who had been too afraid or too broken to show themselves initially. Some carried faded photographs of lost loved ones, holding them up like evidence for an invisible jury. Others brought containers of discolored water, shaking them so the sediment swirled like accusations made liquid. The gathering grew into an impromptu memorial, with each person adding their voice to the growing chorus of testimony. An old man spoke of his son, who had worked in the mines and died of lung disease before his 30th birthday. A young mother told of her baby, born with deformities after she drank contaminated water during pregnancy. A former mine worker showed the chemical burns on his hands from handling equipment without proper protection. Traoré listened to every story, his presence serving as both witness and judge. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the village square with the authority of someone who had seen the full scope of the injustice and would not rest until it was addressed. "I came here to see the truth," he said, his words audible to everyone present. "Now I have seen it, and I swear to you by everything I hold sacred, those responsible will answer for every life lost, every drop of water poisoned, every home destroyed. They will kneel not only before the gold they stole, but before the people they wronged." A murmur ran through the crowd, building into a low chant that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Justice, justice. It wasn't shouted or screamed, it was spoken with the quiet determination of people who had endured too much to be satisfied with anything less than complete accountability. As the convoy prepared to leave, Mariam stepped close to Traoré one final time. "Captain," she said, softly, "when you stand before them in judgment, remember this place. Remember Musa, and remember that some wounds cannot be healed with money alone. They require truth, acknowledgement, and the kind of justice that changes hearts as well as laws." He met her gaze with the full weight of his commitment. "I will remember every word, every face, every name." As they drove away, the village receded into the distance, becoming a ghost of what it had once been. But the image of Mariam, standing beside the sealed well, her staff planted firmly in the poisoned earth, remained vivid in everyone's mind. The fight was no longer just about stolen gold, it was about stolen lives. And that realization transformed the entire nature of the justice they were seeking. The gold tunnel felt different now, no longer a hidden chamber of secrets, but a cathedral of accountability. The air was cooler than expected, and every surface seemed to catch and amplify the harsh white light of portable flood lamps. The walls themselves appeared to pulse with significance, each vein of gold serving as both evidence and witness to the crimes that had been committed. Soldiers lined the entrance with rifles slung but ready, their presence serving not as intimidation, but as a reminder that this justice belonged to the people, protected by those who served the nation rather than foreign interests. Beyond them, cameras from national and international television crews captured every moment, their lenses trained on what would become one of the most significant trials in African history. In the center of the tunnel, the American executives knelt on the polished stone floor, their expensive suits now rumpled and stained with the dust of their downfall. Their hands were bound with military restraints, but their real captivity was the weight of truth that surrounded them, making escape impossible, even if their bonds were cut. The tunnel began to fill as witnesses entered. Not lawyers in expensive suits or judges in formal robes, but the people whose lives had been destroyed by corporate greed. They came slowly, reverently, as if entering a sacred space. Villagers clutched photographs of lost children. Former miners carried broken tools and dented helmets that told stories of dangerous working conditions and workplace casualties. Mothers held jars of contaminated water, the murky liquid serving as liquid evidence of environmental crimes. Each person who entered added to the weight of testimony that would be delivered. This was not a courtroom in the traditional sense. There were no formal procedures, no legal technicalities, no opportunities for high-priced lawyers to obscure truth with procedural objections. This was the people's tribunal, and the people themselves would serve as both jury and judge. At the far end of the tunnel, Captain Traoré stood with his characteristic stillness. His military bearing served as an anchor point for the proceedings. He didn't need to speak yet. His mere presence commanded the space and reminded everyone present that this moment had been earned through courage, investigation, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The first witness to step forward was Mariam, her wooden staff tapping against the stone floor as she walked, without hesitation, towards the kneeling executives. She stopped only a few feet away from them, close enough that they could see the lines carved into her face by years of struggle and loss. When she spoke, her voice carried through the tunnel with the clarity of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. "You took my grandson's life," she said, her tone steady but heavy with accumulated grief. "You poisoned our water, destroyed our land, and left us to bury our children in the soil that will never grow again. You thought distance would protect you, that no one would come for you in your comfortable offices and gated compounds." She paused, letting her words settle into the silence before continuing. "I am here to tell you that we came. We found you, and now you must face what you have done." The executives avoided her gaze, staring at the floor as if they could hide from the truth by refusing to acknowledge it. But Mariam's voice followed them into their attempted escape from reality. "Look at me," she commanded with an authority that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. "Look at the face of someone whose family you destroyed for profit." Reluctantly, fearfully, one of the men raised his eyes to meet hers. In that moment, the full weight of what they had done became visible, not as an abstract business transaction, but as the deliberate destruction of human lives for financial gain. Mariam stepped back, and the next witness came forward, Yakuba, a former miner, whose hands bore the permanent scars of dangerous work in unsafe conditions. He carried a dented metal helmet, holding it up for the cameras and the kneeling executives to see. "This belonged to my brother," he said, his voice rough from years of breathing mining dust. He died in your tunnels when the walls caved in because you refused to install proper safety supports. We dug him out with our bare hands while your supervisors calculated how quickly they could resume operations." His eyes swept across the executives with contempt. "You see gold when you look at our land. We see graves. Graves of our brothers, our fathers, our sons who died to make you wealthy while their families received nothing but condolences and threats to stay silent." More witnesses followed in steady succession, each adding their voice to the growing chorus of testimony. A young mother spoke of her baby born with birth defects after she drank contaminated water during pregnancy. A teacher described schools that closed because mining operations had poisoned the groundwater. A traditional healer told of medicinal plants that no longer grew because the soil had been saturated with industrial chemicals. Each story was a blow not just to the men kneeling on the floor, but to anyone who had believed that the theft of resources was merely an economic crime. This testimony revealed it as something far more serious, a systematic assault on the life, health, and future of an entire people. Awa Diarra moved through the crowd with reverent attention, her camera capturing every word, every tear, every moment of recognition as truth was spoken aloud. The gold walls amplified every voice, creating a haunting chorus where individual testimonies merged into a collective indictment that seemed to emanate from the very stones. When the last witness had spoken, the silence in the tunnel was profound, not empty, but full of accumulated truth that seemed to press against the walls like a living force. Captain Traoré finally stepped forward, his boots clicking against the stone in a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the nation itself. He stopped directly in front of the kneeling executives, close enough that they could see their own guilt reflected in his unwavering gaze. For a long moment he said nothing, letting the weight of all they had heard settle into their consciousness like poison settling into groundwater. "You built your wealth on the bones of my people," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of absolute moral certainty. "You believed that distance and power would protect you from accountability. You convinced yourselves that our silence was weakness, that our poverty was permission." He gestured toward the villagers and the gold-veined walls that surrounded them all. "Look around you now. This is where your arrogance has brought you, kneeling in the very place you used to rob us, surrounded by the people you thought would never find their voice." One of the executives, a man whose silver hair had once commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents, raised his head slightly. His voice carried traces of the old entitlement, even in defeat. "We were only following legal contracts, Captain. Everything we did was within the framework of international business law." Traoré's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew harder. "Legal," he repeated, the word carrying all the contempt it deserved. "Was it legal to bribe officials while children died of thirst? Was it legal to poison rivers that had sustained communities for generations? Was it legal to hide behind shell companies while families buried their dead?" He took a step closer, his voice dropping to just above a whisper, but somehow carrying more power than any shout. "Here there is no law except the law of truth. No court except the court of the people you wronged. No judge except those who suffered while you prospered." The crowd's murmur began to swell, voices calling out for justice in forms both ancient and immediate. Some demanded prison sentences, Others called for the executives to work the same dangerous conditions they had imposed on local miners. Still others wanted them to clean the rivers they had poisoned with their own hands until the water ran clear again. Traoré raised his hand, and the voices gradually quieted. "Justice will be decided here," he announced, his words carrying the finality of a judgment that had been years in the making. He turned toward Miriam, acknowledging her as the representative voice of all who had suffered. "What is your judgment on these men?" The elderly woman stepped forward again, her staff supporting her as she moved with the dignity of someone who had endured more than anyone should have to bear. Her eyes never left the faces of the kneeling executives as she spoke. "They should live to see what they destroyed rebuilt without them. Let them work the poisoned land they created until their hands are as rough as ours. Let them see every brick laid and every well dug with the gold they stole, and let them never leave this soil they contaminated." Yakuba spoke next, his voice rough but determined. "No comfort, no escape. They must rebuild the schools they caused to close and dig the wells they poisoned. They will work until the last child they harmed has clean water to drink, and they will never see their homeland again." Traoré looked back at the condemned men, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "You hear them," he said quietly, "and you will obey them, because here you are no longer executives with corporate protection and diplomatic immunity. You are prisoners of the people whose lives you destroyed, and you will live with the consequences of your choices until your last breath." He stepped back as soldiers moved in to escort the men away. The sound of shackles echoed through the tunnel, not the harsh clang of brutality, but the measured click of accountability finally being imposed. As the executives were led through the tunnel toward transport vehicles that would take them to facilities where they would spend the remainder of their lives, the chants from outside grew louder. "Justice! Justice!" The words seemed to bounce off the gold walls and multiply, becoming not just a demand, but a celebration of its achievement. The villagers remained in the tunnel after the condemned men had been removed, standing among the gleaming walls that were finally, truly theirs again. Some touched the gold-veined stone, as if confirming that it was real, that this moment was not a dream that would vanish with morning light. Others simply stood in the profound silence that follows the completion of a long and difficult journey. They had come seeking acknowledgement of their suffering, and they had received not just recognition, but justice. The gold that had been stolen from their land would now serve their future, and those who had profited from their misery would spend their remaining years working to repair the damage they had caused. As the cameras finally stopped rolling and the crowd began to disperse, Miriam remained a few moments longer. She placed her weathered hand on the tunnel wall, feeling the cool metal that had witnessed so much pain but had finally become a monument to the possibility of justice. "Now," she whispered to herself, "our children can rest." The marble hallways of the State Department buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with routine diplomacy. By the time the sun rose over Washington, D.C., every major news outlet in the world was broadcasting footage from the Gold Tunnel. Images of American executives kneeling before African villagers, while Captain Ibrahim Traoré delivered what could only be described as a judgment that would reshape international relations for generations. Inside the emergency briefing room, faces around the polished oak table reflected a mixture of panic, anger, and the kind of cold calculation that emerges when empires realize their foundations are cracking. The footage played on repeat on wall-mounted screens, the tunnel's golden walls gleaming under harsh lights. the villagers speaking their truth to power, the moment when justice was pronounced by those who had suffered rather than those who had prospered. "We need damage control and we need it immediately," the Secretary of State declared, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This cannot be allowed to stand as precedent. If one African nation can seize American assets and put American citizens on trial, every resource deal on the continent becomes vulnerable." The Africa Bureau chief, a career diplomat whose understanding of the continent had been shaped by decades of managing extraction relationships, leaned forward with visible frustration. "The problem is that Traoré has turned this into a morality play with perfect optics. We're not just dealing with a legal dispute, we're dealing with a narrative that makes us look like colonial exploiters while he appears as a liberation hero." Around the table, minds that had orchestrated interventions and shaped global policy for decades struggled with an unfamiliar problem. An African leader who couldn't be bought, threatened, or manipulated, and who had the support of his people in ways that made traditional pressure tactics not just ineffective but counterproductive. The National Security Advisor, a woman whose career had been built on managing American hegemony, voiced the fear that none of them wanted to acknowledge directly. If Traoré succeeds in this, if he can seize American assets, try American citizens, and survive the backlash, it will inspire every resource-rich nation in Africa to reassess their relationships with foreign extractors. We could lose strategic control over mineral supplies that are essential to American technology and defense industries. Meanwhile, at the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou, a different kind of crisis was unfolding. Ambassador Richardson, a veteran diplomat who had spent his career managing the delicate relationships between American corporate interests and African governments, found himself in uncharted territory. His usual tools of influence, economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, threats of aid withdrawal, seemed inadequate against a leader who had captured the imagination of his people and much of the world. "Sir," his deputy chief of mission reported during an emergency briefing, "we've received instructions from Washington to demand the immediate release of American citizens, but our intelligence suggests that any public pressure from us will only strengthen Traoré's position domestically. The population sees this as their moment of independence, and American pressure will be interpreted as colonial interference." The ambassador stared out the window toward the distant glow of the city, where he could hear the faint sound of celebrations that had been continuing since the tunnel judgment. "What about economic leverage, sanctions, trade restrictions?" "That's where it gets complicated, sir. Burkina Faso's economy was already largely disconnected from American markets. They've been building relationships with China, India, and several European nations that are increasingly sympathetic to resource nationalism. Sanctions might hurt them, but they won't break them, and the optics will be devastating for us globally." The conversation was interrupted by an aide rushing in with a tablet displaying breaking news. Leaked cables from the embassy's own files, showing years of correspondence between American diplomats and mining executives. The cables revealed not just knowledge of environmental damage and labor violations, but active assistance in maintaining operations despite clear evidence of harm to local populations. "How did these get out?" the ambassador demanded. But he already knew the answer. In the digital age, secrets had a way of finding light, especially when people were motivated by righteous anger and global attention was focused on uncovering truth. Within hours, the leaked cables were being analyzed by news organizations around the world. The documents revealed a pattern of American diplomatic support for extraction operations that had caused documented environmental disasters, health crises, and social disruption. Email chains showed embassy staff dismissing concerns about poisoned water supplies as manageable public relations challenges and describing local protests as minor inconveniences that could be handled through appropriate pressure on local authorities. One cable, dated just 18 months earlier, contained language that would haunt American foreign policy for years. The extraction rates from the Burkina Faso operations exceed all projections. Environmental concerns remain secondary to strategic resource acquisition. Local population compliance remains high due to effective management of information flow and strategic placement of cooperative officials. The revelation that American diplomats had actively collaborated in covering up the environmental and human costs of resource extraction turned what had been a complex international incident into a clear-cut moral crisis. Editorial boards that had initially criticized Traoré's methods now began praising his courage. International law scholars debated whether resource nationalism might actually be justified under principles of national sovereignty and environmental protection. In Brussels, European Union officials found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Several member nations had been complicit in processing and refining the stolen gold through their banking and refinery systems. The leaked evidence showed European banks knowingly laundering proceeds from illegal mining operations, while European refineries processed gold that had been extracted under conditions that violated every international standard for environmental and labor protection. "We have a credibility crisis," the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs told an emergency meeting of foreign ministers. "If we condemn Traoré's actions while ignoring European complicity in the crimes he's prosecuting, we lose all moral authority in Africa and much of the developing world." The response from European capitals was swift but fragmented. Some nations, particularly those with strong environmental movements and growing awareness of colonial legacies, began quietly expressing support for Burkina Faso's right to reclaim stolen resources. Others, more concerned with protecting established business relationships, called for diplomatic solutions that would restore the status quo. But the most significant response came not from government buildings, but from the streets of major European cities. In London, protesters gathered outside the Bank of England holding signs reading "African Gold, African Future." In Paris, demonstrations outside major banks demanded investigations into gold laundering operations. In Amsterdam, activists projected images from the gold tunnel onto the facades of corporate headquarters, creating a visual link between European wealth and African suffering. The movement was spreading beyond Africa, becoming a global question about resource justice, corporate accountability, and the rights of nations to control their own natural wealth. University students in Boston organized solidarity rallies. Environmental groups in California drew connections between African resource extraction and climate change. Labor unions in Germany questioned why their members should support companies that exploited workers in other parts of the world. But perhaps the most telling response came from other African capitals, where governments found themselves caught between their established relationships with foreign extractors and growing domestic pressure to follow Traoré's example. In Ghana, opposition parties demanded audits of all gold mining contracts. In Nigeria, civil society groups called for investigations into oil revenue distribution. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, labor unions began organizing around the slogan, "Congolese minerals for Congolese development." The geopolitical implications were staggering. For decades, the global economy had been built on the assumption that African resources would remain available to international markets at prices that were favorable to foreign consumers rather than African producers. Traoré's actions suggested this assumption might no longer hold, and the implications rippled through commodity markets, strategic planning departments, and international development agencies. In Beijing, Chinese officials watched the unfolding situation with particular interest. China had been building economic relationships across Africa through infrastructure investments and resource partnerships, which, while still primarily serving Chinese interests, offered more favorable terms to African partners than traditional Western arrangements. The crisis in Burkina Faso presented both an opportunity and a challenge. An opportunity to position China as a more respectful partner than Western nations, but also a challenge if resource nationalism began affecting Chinese projects as well. Russian analysts saw the situation as validation of their long-standing argument that Western democracy and human rights advocacy were merely covers for economic exploitation. State media portrayed Traoré as a hero standing up to Western imperialism, while quietly hoping that similar movements wouldn't emerge in regions where Russian companies had significant investments. But the most profound impact was being felt in the quiet conversations happening in presidential palaces, ministerial offices, and corporate boardrooms across Africa. Leaders who had spent their careers managing relationships with foreign extractors were suddenly facing a new calculation. The political cost of appearing to serve foreign interests rather than national ones was becoming higher than the economic cost of confronting those interests. The Gold Tunnel had become more than a site of judgment. It had become a symbol of possibility that was reshaping how an entire continent thought about sovereignty, dignity, and the right to benefit from the wealth beneath their feet. The movement began not with grand proclamations or organized leadership, but with individual acts of conscience that merged into something larger than anyone could have planned. In mining towns across Burkina Faso, workers who had spent years in enforced silence began walking away from their shifts, not in anger, but in recognition that their moment had finally arrived. They emerged from underground shafts carrying the tools of their labor: pickaxes worn smooth by years of use, helmets dented from falling rocks, lamps that had guided them through tunnels carved for other people's profit. These weren't just mining implements, they were symbols of work performed under conditions that enriched foreigners while leaving local communities in poverty and environmental ruin. In Bobo Dioulasso, the march began with 12 men who had worked the same mine for over a decade. They walked through the town center in their dust-covered uniforms, their silence more powerful than any speech. As word spread through the community, others joined. Women who had lost husbands to mining accidents, children whose playgrounds had been contaminated by runoff, elders who remembered when the rivers ran clear. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, their number had grown to several hundred. But this was just the beginning. News of their march spread through social networks, radio broadcasts, and the ancient communication system of word of mouth that had always connected African communities across vast distances. From Koudougou came a column of former miners, their faces weathered by years of breathing dust that had shortened their lives to enrich foreign shareholders. From Wahiguya marched teachers whose schools had been closed when mining operations contaminated local water supplies. From Dori came farmers whose fields had been rendered barren by chemical runoff, carrying samples of poisoned soil in glass jars as evidence of what had been stolen from them. The convergence on the capital became a river of humanity flowing across the landscape. Thousands of people walking dusty roads under the African sun. Their chant simple but powerful. Gold for the people, not for thieves. The rhythm of their voices matched the steady beat of feet on earth, creating a sound that seemed to emanate from the land itself. Awa Diarra traveled with the marchers, her camera capturing faces that told individual stories of exploitation and resistance. She interviewed a man named Amadou, who carried his deceased father's mining helmet. 3 months' wages for a year of work, he told her, holding up a faded pay stub. They told us the rest went to taxes and equipment costs. Now we know where it really went, into foreign bank accounts, while our children went to bed hungry. An elderly woman named Fatima walked alongside her grandson, both carrying homemade signs demanding clean water. "I have buried 3 grandchildren from diseases caused by their poison," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes reflecting depths of grief. "I march so the children still alive might have a future." As the columns of marchers approached Ouagadougou, Captain Traoré made a decision that would define his relationship with his people for generations. Rather than watching from a secure location or greeting them through formal ceremonies, he chose to meet them on the road. No barriers, no security detail, no diplomatic protocol. When the lead marchers crested a hill and saw him standing alone in the center of the highway, a profound silence fell over the crowd. Here was the man who had dared to challenge the international order on their behalf, waiting for them not as a distant leader, but as one person among many seeking justice. The silence lasted only a moment before the crowd surged forward, not in aggression, but in recognition. These were people who had spent years believing that power belonged to others, that their voices didn't matter, that their suffering was invisible to those who made decisions. Now they were face to face with someone who had proven that their lives had value worth fighting for. A delegation of former miners approached Traoré first, their spokesman, a tall, lean man whose hands bore the permanent scars of underground work. "Captain, we have been silent too long. We want more than justice for the guilty. We want the gold returned to serve the people, not hidden in foreign vaults or sold to foreign markets." Traoré looked out over the sea of faces stretching back along the road as far as the eye could see. He saw the exhaustion lines carved by years of exploitation, but also the dignity of people who had found their voice and the courage to use it. "I have seen what was taken from you," he replied, his words carrying across the crowd without amplification. "I have walked through villages where children died from poisoned water while executives lived in luxury. I have held the contracts that sold your heritage for bribes. I have stood in the tunnel where they stored your stolen gold while your communities crumbled." His voice grew stronger, fed by the energy of the crowd and the righteousness of their cause. "I promise you this. Every ounce of gold recovered will be accounted for. Every stolen coin will be transformed into something that serves your future, schools where your children can learn, hospitals where they can heal, clean water they can drink without fear." An elderly miner stepped forward and removed his helmet, ancient, dented, held together with tape and determination. He offered it to Traoré with his hands that shook slightly from years of dangerous work. "This is all I kept from those years," he said. "Take it, melt it down with the rest, let it become something that builds instead of destroys." Traoré accepted the helmet with both hands, holding it as if it were made of the most precious metal. "It will," he said simply, and in those 2 words was contained a commitment that would reshape the nation's future. The gesture sparked something that no organizer could have planned. Throughout the crowd, miners began removing their helmets and holding them high. The metal caught the afternoon sun, creating a forest of gleaming symbols that represented not just labor, but transformation. Some helmets were pristine, recently purchased by men still working dangerous shifts. Others were ancient artifacts, passed down from fathers to sons who had followed the same dangerous path. As the procession continued toward the capital, more people joined from roadside communities. Shopkeepers closed their businesses to walk alongside farmers. Students left their classrooms to march with laborers. Religious leaders from different faiths walked side by side, their differences set aside in the face of shared commitment to justice. By the time they reached Independence Square in the heart of Ouagadougou, the crowd filled every available space and spilled into surrounding streets. The square had seen many gatherings over the years: political rallies, independence celebrations, protests that had been dispersed by security forces. But this was different. This was not people asking for change. This was a people announcing that change had already begun. Traoré climbed the steps of the government building and turned to face the crowd. Behind him, the flag of Burkina Faso snapped in the wind, its colors bright against the golden light of late afternoon. Before him, thousands of faces looked up expectantly, but there was no desperation in their expressions. They had already won the victory that mattered most: the restoration of their own dignity. "You have marched for justice," he said, his voice carrying across the square and into the streets beyond. "And justice will answer you. But remember this: justice is not a destination. It is a way of living. It is not something that is given to you. It is something you claim and defend every day." He gestured toward the crowd, encompassing all of them in his words. "This march does not end when you return to your homes. It continues when you demand that your work benefits your families. It continues when you insist that your resources serve your communities. It continues when you teach your children that they are the inheritors of wealth, not its servants." The square erupted in cheers and chants, but underneath the celebration was something deeper: the understanding that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no retreat. They had announced to themselves, their government, and the world that they would no longer accept exploitation as inevitable. As the sun set over the capital, the crowd did not immediately disperse. Instead, they remained in the square as darkness fell and stars appeared overhead. Some shared food they had brought for the journey. Others told stories of relatives lost to mining accidents or environmental poisoning. Children fell asleep in their parents' arms, while adults continued conversations about the future they wanted to build. The march had accomplished something that no amount of legislation or international negotiation could achieve. It had transformed a population from subjects into citizens, from victims into agents of their own destiny. The gold tunnel had been the site of judgment, but Independence Square had become the birthplace of a new relationship between a people and their wealth. 3 months after the gold tunnel judgment, the foundry on the outskirts of Ouagadougou had been transformed into something unprecedented in modern Africa, a facility where stolen wealth was being converted directly into national infrastructure. The massive industrial complex, once used to process gold for foreign export, now served as the beating heart of Burkina Faso's reconstruction program. The heat inside was intense but purposeful. Massive furnaces glowed white-hot as tons of recovered gold, bars that had been hidden in secret vaults, nuggets that had been smuggled through illegal tunnels, refined metal that had been laundered through European banks was melted down and reformed into ingots bearing the national seal of Burkina Faso. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood on an elevated platform overlooking the foundry floor, wearing not his military uniform but simple civilian clothes that reflected his evolution from military leader to national steward. Around him, workers moved with precision and pride, understanding that they were not just processing gold but transforming their nation's future. The scene was being broadcast live across Burkina Faso and internationally, with cameras positioned to capture every moment of the historic transformation. The world had watched the confrontation in the gold tunnel, witnessed the trials and judgment, and observed the popular movements that had swept the nation. Now they would see the practical fulfillment of promises made in the heat of struggle. "This gold represents more than mineral wealth," Traoré said, addressing the cameras and the crowd gathered outside the foundry. "It represents the blood, sweat, and dreams of generations who worked this land. For too long it flowed out of our country to enrich others while our people remained poor. Today, that changes forever." He gestured toward the first completed ingot, still cooling from the molding process. The surface gleamed with fresh stamp marks, the crossed horses and shield of the national coat of arms, surrounded by text in local languages declaring this gold to be the property of the people of Burkina Faso. It was more than a symbol. It was a declaration of sovereignty that could be weighed, measured, and counted. "Every bar you see created here will remain in this country. Not 1 ounce will be sold to foreign markets. Not 1 gram will disappear into overseas vaults. This gold will build schools where our children learn in their own languages, hospitals where they receive care regardless of their family's wealth, and water systems that deliver clean, safe water to every community." The crowd outside the foundry erupted in celebration, their cheers rolling through the building and mixing with the industrial sounds of transformation. Inside, workers straightened with visible pride, understanding that their labor was serving not distant shareholders, but their own neighbors and children. Awa Diarra moved through the facility with her camera, documenting a process that many had thought impossible in the modern global economy. She captured the faces of workers who had once processed gold for foreign export, now creating wealth that would remain in their own communities. She recorded the moment when each ingot was lifted from its mold, steam still rising from the cooling metal. But the most powerful footage was of the ingots themselves, row after row of gleaming gold bars, each one stamped with symbols that declared them to be permanently African property. The visual impact was undeniable. This was wealth that had been reclaimed and would serve African purposes, created by African labor on African soil. Outside the foundry, a massive screen projected the live feed for thousands who had gathered to witness the moment. Families pointed out the national seal to children, explaining that this gold would build their schools and hospitals. Former miners wept openly as they watched metal they had risked their lives to extract finally being transformed into something that would serve their own communities. The transformation process had been carefully documented by international observers to prevent any claims of irregularity. Representatives from the African Union, various European nations, and international financial institutions had certified that the gold being processed had indeed been recovered from illegal operations and was being converted according to transparent procedures. More importantly, the distribution plan had been developed through extensive consultation with community leaders, traditional authorities, and ordinary citizens. Priority would be given to villages that had suffered environmental damage from mining operations. Medical facilities would be established in regions where mining-related health problems were most prevalent. Educational infrastructure would be concentrated in areas where schools had been closed due to contamination or economic disruption. As the day progressed, the symbolic power of the event became increasingly clear. This was not just about gold or mining or even economic justice. It was about the fundamental question of who controls the wealth generated by African resources and for whose benefit that wealth would be used. The condemned American executives, now serving their sentences in work camps where they were helping to clean up the environmental damage they had caused, watched the broadcast from their basic quarters. The contrast with their former luxury was stark. Where they had once lived in air-conditioned compounds while local communities lacked clean water, they now lived in simple barracks while that same gold was being transformed into infrastructure that would serve those communities for generations. International reactions were mixed, but increasingly respectful. Initial condemnations of Traoré's methods had given way to grudging acknowledgement that he had delivered on his promises in ways that benefited ordinary citizens rather than political elites. Editorial boards that had once criticized his approach now wrote admiringly of a leader who had translated revolutionary rhetoric into concrete improvements in people's lives. The economic implications were being studied in business schools and policy institutes around the world. Burkina Faso had demonstrated that it was possible for a resource-rich African nation to break free from extraction relationships that primarily benefited foreign interests. The model was being examined by leaders across the continent, many of whom were quietly beginning to renegotiate their own resource deals with foreign companies. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the consciousness of ordinary Africans. The Gold Foundry broadcast was watched in homes, community centers, and public spaces across the continent. People saw African wealth being controlled by African institutions for African benefit, and the psychological effect was profound. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, the foundry continued its work under floodlights. The transformation would continue for weeks as more recovered gold was processed and converted into the building blocks of national development. Each ingot that emerged from the cooling molds represented not just reclaimed wealth, but reclaimed dignity. Standing in the glow of the foundry fires, Traoré reflected on the journey from the midnight raid on the mining compound to this moment of national transformation. The gold tunnel had been the site of judgment, but the foundry had become the workshop of justice, a place where abstract principles were being forged into concrete reality that would serve generations yet unborn. The chants from outside the facility continued long into the night. Our gold, our future. It was more than a slogan. It had become the organizing principle of a nation that had chosen to control its own destiny, rather than serving the interests of distant powers. In the golden glow of the foundry, that choice was being made manifest in the most literal way possible. African gold, serving African dreams, shaped by African hands, dedicated to African futures. 5 years after the confrontation that shook the world, the gold tunnel had been transformed into something unprecedented, a memorial that served not only as a reminder of past exploitation, but as a testament to the possibility of justice. The walls still glimmed with their veins of natural gold, but now they were illuminated by soft, respectful lighting that made the space feel sacred rather than commercial. Bronze plaques covered the tunnel walls, each one engraved with the names of communities that had suffered from illegal mining operations. Beneath the community names were listed individuals who had died from mining-related causes, children poisoned by contaminated water, workers killed in unsafe conditions, families destroyed by environmental devastation. The effect was overwhelming in its scope and profoundly moving in its specificity. Visitors came daily from across Africa and around the world. Busloads of students studying African history, delegations of leaders examining models of resource sovereignty, families making pilgrimages to honor relatives whose names were carved into the bronze memorials. The tunnel had become one of the most visited sites on the continent, but unlike many tourist attractions, it maintained an atmosphere of reverence appropriate to its function as both memorial and inspiration. At the center of the tunnel, a single block of unrefined gold rested on a pedestal of black stone. Around its base, words were carved in 3 languages, French, Moray, and English. For the people, for the land, for the future. The block had been left deliberately unprocessed, a reminder that the true value of natural resources lay not in their extraction, but in their service to the communities from which they came. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, now serving his second term as democratically elected president, visited the memorial regularly. He came not for ceremonies or photo opportunities, but for personal reflection and connection with the memory of those whose suffering had catalyzed the transformation of his nation. On this particular morning, he walked the length of the tunnel slowly, his footsteps echoing softly against stone that had witnessed both exploitation and justice. Behind him, the sound of children's voices grew steadily louder, a school group arriving for their annual visit to learn about their nation's history and their own role in protecting its future. The children were from villages that had been rebuilt with gold recovered from the illegal mining operations. Their schools were constructed with funds that had once sat in offshore accounts. Their teachers paid with revenues that had previously disappeared into foreign pockets. They represented the tangible fulfillment of promises made during the darkest hours of national crisis. As Traoré emerged from the tunnel into brilliant sunlight, he was greeted by a sight that never failed to move him. Dozens of children in bright school uniforms, their faces eager and curious, rather than marked by poverty and environmental illness that had characterized previous generations. They carried notebooks where they would record what they learned, and many held small replicas of the national seal that had been stamped onto the reclaimed gold. "Uncle President," one young girl called out, using the informal but respectful term that had become customary, "will you tell us about the tunnel?" He smiled and knelt to her level, as had become his practice when speaking with the children who represented his nation's future. "What would you like to know, Amina?" "My grandmother says that bad men used to steal our gold, but now the gold builds our schools. How did that happen?" It was a complex question that touched on international law, resource sovereignty, environmental justice, and the fundamental principles of national self-determination. But Traoré had learned to explain even the most complicated concepts in terms that children could understand and remember. "Sometimes," he began, "people with power think they can take things that don't belong to them because they are far away and strong. They forget that taking something that belongs to someone else is stealing, even if they have papers that say it's legal." The children listened with the intense focus they reserved for stories that mattered to their own lives. Around them, their teachers and the international visitors who had come to witness this informal civics lesson also paid close attention. "But what we learned," Traoré continued, "is that when people who have been hurt by stealing work together, they can be stronger than the people who took from them. Your parents and grandparents decided they would not stay silent anymore. They decided to speak the truth about what was stolen and demand that it be returned." A boy near the back raised his hand. "Were the bad men punished?" He replied, "They were judged by the people they hurt, but more importantly, they were required to help fix what they had broken. The gold they stole is now building your schools and hospitals. The rivers they poisoned are being cleaned. The villages they damaged are being rebuilt." An older girl, perhaps 12 or 13, asked a more sophisticated question. "Well, other countries tried to steal from us again?" Traoré stood and looked out over the group, seeing in their faces the future he had fought to secure. "They might try," he said honestly, "but now you know the truth about your worth and your rights. As long as you remember